Hi, I'm Wes Allen with DM Tales, and today I'm going to be doing my first review. This is Basic Fantasy Role-Playing Game. Let's roll it. First off, when you're looking at Basic Fantasy Role-Playing Game, look at this cover art. I mean, this is absolutely gorgeous. It really brings to mind the types of books that I would have played with as a kid. And much like the game itself, the cover art elicits a blend of both Basic Expert and original AD&D. It evokes that type of feeling. To me, I just look at it and I absolutely marvel. I love everything about it. The game itself is currently in its third edition, although when you listen to the author of the game, he kind of points out that the editions really don't matter. All they're really doing is kind of fixing things along the way. Sometimes it's a typo, sometimes it's a little bit of a game mechanic. So if you're playing so-called first edition and you're downloading new third edition things, there's no real updating that you have to do. All of Basic Fantasy Role-Playing Games products, for lack of a better term, are compatible with every one of the other Basic Fantasy Role-Playing Games products. Pretty cool. The game itself is set up in a way that elicits old school game design. It's set up currently in 8 parts in 3rd edition, last part being game master information, and part 2 being where most of the players are going to want to spend their time in player character creation. So part 2 is player characters and how to create a sheet. And if you look here, I'll zoom in a little bit, that's the character sheet. One of the things when I switched to 5e that I marveled at was just how many pages my character sheet was. I had actions and bonus actions and items and spells and secondary skills. And again, I enjoy 5e and it's a lot of fun, but trying to run a character for the first time after being away from D&D for the better part of 3 decades, it was a little daunting. I've gotten the hang of it, but it's a little much. By contrast, Basic Fantasy RPG really looks old school. This is the type of character sheet that you would have been able to do on lined paper, which is exactly what this picture looks like, and done it in a couple of minutes and then just been free to go and play. I really enjoy that. I love the simplicity. So much of who the character is and what the character is all about is just completely left in the mind of the player. They design it as they go. Ability scores in Basic Fantasy RPG are done completely old school. You roll 3d6 in order for all of the prime attributes, and that is your character. A little bit later in the book, they do give some options because if you really have your heart set on being a cleric or a magic user or a thief, and you don't really roll that well for that ability, the authors of the game really want you to have some wiggle room to get to play the character you really have a heart to play. This will probably feel really strange to anybody who's coming from a more modern style game where you have things like the basic matrix of ability scores that you can plug in and you pick whatever you want to be your quote-unquote dump stat. In Basic Fantasy RPG, you can end up with several what we would consider dump stats nowadays, but that's just the character you have to play. The general rule of thumb is that if your bonuses are greater than your penalties, then you should be able to play that character. If your penalties are greater than your bonuses, then maybe you can scratch it and say, this is a hopeless character, it's not going to be any fun to play, and we'll start over again. But again, rolling a new character is so simple that having to do this a couple of times really doesn't take away anything from the experience. And in fact, I think that people who are playing a character that's not totally maxed out on their stats that they really love can alter play in a way that makes role-playing more dynamic. There are 4 basic races for characters to play in the core rulebook: dwarves, elves, halflings, and humans. Again, this goes all the way back to the old school basic and expert. Elves, hearkening back to the rules in BX or basic expert, can be combination classes, a fighter magic user or a magic user thief. No other race is able to do this. To go along with the 4 basic character races, there are 4 basic character classes: cleric, fighter, magic user, and thief. Now, magic users of first level are way squishy. Thieves are not much better. They have 1d4 hit points, and if you roll bad constitution, you could be in trouble. They also only have one spell at first level, and by default, there are no cantrips in Basic Fantasy RPG. There's a supplement that'll enable some of these things, but really cantrips don't have any practical effect inside the game. You're not going to get something that does damage with a cantrip that you can cast at will. There are a couple of magic user supplements you can download, however, that do give magic users an ability to essentially have unlimited daggers through something called an arcane bolt. I'm not sure I'm going to be using this at all, but it's there if people really feel that first level magic users are just a little bit too squishy. One of the things that has always driven me nuts about old school play, however, is that clerics do not have spells at first level. I get why this is. In my written review of Basic Fantasy RPG, I pointed out that in old school gaming, you're essentially meeting your player character the moment they decide to figuratively get up off the farm and go take up an adventuring lifestyle. So if you're a cleric who is living in some sort of holy order and you have that impulse to be like, I'm getting out of this place, chances are you haven't learned any spells yet, and you're going to have to earn favor or a relationship with whatever divinity you're serving in order to gain those at upper levels. I don't know if I'd want to jigger the rules that much to bring Cure Wounds out early. To me, it would be throwing a bone to an early level party. It would allow them to go maybe more than one combat encounter inside a crawl before they had to retreat and heal up. The other thing I really love that's included in Basic Fantasy RPG is the return of old school thieves' abilities. Open locks, remove traps, pick pockets, move silently, climb walls, hide, and listen. Another cool thing about Basic Fantasy RPG is the sheer amount of artwork that's included in the core rulebook. Each one of these drawings harkens back to those old school type publications. This drawing I could easily see being included in the old Basic and Expert sets that I grew up with, or even the first edition AD&D books that I collected when I was a teenager. There's a lot of people who really believe in this project, and they've contributed their talents to it. And the artwork is really one place where that shines. One of the interesting things about Basic Fantasy RPG is that it doesn't split cleric and magic user spells out into different sections of the book. There's just spells. They're all just done in alphabetical order. They're not set up by level. They're not set up by who can cast what. It's just this spell begins with an A, so this spell is here. Combat in Basic Fantasy is also pared down from what people might expect in 5th edition or Pathfinder. It is, relatively speaking, simple. All initiatives are rolled with a 1d6, so you're going way old school with that. And players or monsters who roll the same initiative number, they are considered to act at the same time. So there's a lot of possibility for simultaneous action inside Basic Fantasy RPG combat. I really like that. It adds to the sense that combat is relatively chaotic. Another return to old school style play is the cleric turning undead. This is exactly how I would have remembered it from back in the days of Basic and Expert. One of the things I don't like, however, is that this particular table is very far divided from the cleric character class description in the earlier part of the book. There is a practical reason for it. These numbers are essentially meant for the game master, not for the player, because the player, if they say, I'm going to try to turn that monster, they really should not know, according to old school play, if they're able to do it or not. They're just supposed to roll. There's a cool aspect of gaming of that I can't deny. At the same time, throwing the cleric turn undead table way far back in the book makes it almost like a forgotten ability of clerics. It's easy to overlook for people who don't necessarily read the entire rule set. Also going right back to Basic and Expert style books, this rule book for Basic Fantasy RPG has a sizable monster gallery in it, again with a lot of artwork, not for every creature, but for a good number of them, ranging from the realistic to the stylized to, the kind of goofy. Write-ups are very short. Things are appearing on maybe a quarter of a page, but you cram a lot of creatures in there, and it offers a lot of opportunities for a game master who's looking to stock a dungeon or a different crawl. So where do you get Basic Fantasy RPG? Well, the short answer is you can get it on Amazon or DriveTru RPG or Lulu Press for print copies. There's even a hardback version of it on Amazon right now for under $15, so that's pretty good. However, on the back of each one of Basic Fantasy Role-Playing Games books is a big header that says, "Do not buy this book." The reason why is because you can download them all off the Basic Fantasy website. Do not miss the .org on their URL. When you go to the download section of Basic Fantasy RPG's website, you can see not only the core rules, but some good tips, some field guides, which are like added monster manuals for additional monsters inside the game, added equipment, and an entire campaign world called Morgansfort that really has some wonderful detail. This is something that's worth downloading and checking out because you can get it for free. So who is Basic Fantasy Role-Playing for? Well, if you have never been involved in a tabletop role-playing game before and the prices of buying into something like Pathfinder or D&D 5th edition are a little overwhelming, then maybe Basic Fantasy is a good way to start. You can download all of the core rules for free and many adventures. There's a great support community behind it. And the creator of the game, Chris Gonnerman, has his own YouTube channel where he demonstrates different ways that the game works. So this probably is a good entry point. I'm tempted to say that you can start with Basic Fantasy RPG and then graduate to another role-playing game, but really that's not fair to either other role-playing games or Basic Fantasy. BFRPG is a role-playing game in and of its own right. It's an older style of play, so it might not appeal to some modern gamers, but there's nothing really to graduate to. If you enjoy that style of role-playing game once you get into it, there's many hours of adventuring that you can do. And if it sparks your interest and makes you a little freer to spend some money for some of the more commercial products, then go ahead and do that too. The point is, try Basic Fantasy. It's really worth the effort. Next week, I'm going to go back to talking a little bit about what the Monday Murder Hobos are up to. But until then, happy playing, everyone.